Nobody could have imagined what Keiko would witness on that cloudy autumn morning. Among the moss-covered stones of a Kyoto cemetery, she, a woman known for her unshakable composure and commanding presence, found herself face to face with the most fragile secret her son had ever kept from her. The air smelled of damp earth and fading incense. A fine mist lingered over the small hill where the family grave stood, and the stone lanterns, chipped and leaning, seemed to watch her like silent sentinels. Keiko's wooden sandals clicked faintly on the stone path, her steps deliberate, her back perfectly straight, despite the weight that had bent her spirit for more than a year. She had made this walk countless times since the day they buried Daiki. Every visit followed the same ritual: a quiet bow at the gate, 3 sticks of incense lit and placed carefully at the base of the headstone, a prayer whispered through tight lips. Then silence, always silence. The cemetery was her only refuge. At home, the mansion felt hollow, a cavern of dark wood and unspoken words, where even the staff walked on eggshells. But here, between the rows of graves, she allowed herself to breathe. It was the only place where she could still hear his voice. The memories of her son clung to her like the fog around the stones, his boyish laugh echoing in the family garden, his quiet rebellion during tea ceremonies, his gentle hands as a child shaping tiny castles out of her discarded obi sashes. Daiki had always been a contradiction, obedient in public, but distant in his gaze. She had scolded him once for that, saying, "A man must stand firm in this family. A son does not drift." But drift he did, and now all she had left of him was a name carved into granite. On this particular morning, though, something was wrong. She sensed it before she even reached the top of the path. A faint sound, like the murmur of a lullaby, floated down from the direction of Daiki's grave. Keiko slowed her pace, her eyes narrowing, and then she saw them. A woman knelt at the foot of the grave, young, foreign, her hair the soft yellow-brown of autumn wheat. In her arms she cradled a small boy, perhaps 4 or 5, who clutched a piece of crumpled paper and a handful of crayons. Keiko stopped, her breath catching. The woman's lips moved softly as she brushed a lock of hair from the boy's face. The boy giggled, shy but warm, and carefully laid his paper on the cold stone of Daiki's grave. Even from a distance, Keiko could see what was scrawled across it. A smiling sun, 2 stick figures holding hands, and written in uneven hiragana, "Papa, I miss you, Yoshio." Keiko felt her knees lock. A strange ringing filled her ears as the blood drained from her fingers. No, this was impossible. Her son would never have... But then the boy looked up, his dark copper eyes catching hers from across the stones, and in that instant she saw it. The same eyes she had once kissed goodnight, the same mischievous curve of the mouth that used to make her heart soft before she learned to harden it. Those weren't just any child's eyes. Those were Daiki's eyes.
Keiko was a woman who had mastered the art of silence long before grief taught her its weight. Born into a distinguished Kyoto family, she had been raised to embody elegance and discipline. Her father used to say that a family name was like lacquer, beautiful but fragile. Even the smallest crack could ruin it forever. And so, she never allowed herself to crack. By her early 20s, she was already overseeing her family's centuries-old kimono business, a house renowned for dressing brides, geishas, and politicians alike. Clients would whisper about her impeccable posture, her perfectly arranged hair, and the way her eyes never wavered, even under pressure. Behind closed doors, her standards were no less exacting. Every servant in the mansion knew the rhythm of her footsteps, the precise placement of each flower in the tokonoma, the way she expected the evening tea to be served with quiet efficiency. And yet, for all her composure, there was one place she let herself soften. With her only son, Daiki. He had been a quiet boy, with a gaze that always seemed to drift beyond the boundaries of the tatami rooms. Keiko would watch him build little towers with his wooden blocks in the family garden, his cheeks smudged with dust, his kimono loosened and crooked. She used to correct him sternly, telling him, "You must look the part, Daiki. People are always watching." But inside, she loved his laugh, even if she rarely showed it. As he grew older, she began to mold him into her vision of the perfect heir. She insisted he attend the finest schools, sit through endless dinners with clients, learn the family business down to the smallest stitch. And he did, at least in front of her.
But she could sense that distance growing in his eyes, a quiet rebellion she could never quite name. Sometimes she would catch him staring out the window during meetings, his fingers absent-mindedly sketching something on scraps of paper. She would scold him, and he would bow, but the light behind his eyes never returned. Then, one rainy February night, it happened. A phone call. A car accident. By the time she arrived at the hospital, he was already gone. The world around her didn't end loudly. It simply stopped. The mansion fell quiet in ways she hadn't imagined. The laughter that once faintly echoed through its halls was gone. She closed his room and kept it exactly as it had been, even the scattered drawings on his desk left untouched. She told herself it was to preserve his memory, but in truth, she could not bear to face how little she had really known about him. So she buried him with all the proper rituals. The priest chanted sutras, the family bowed in black, neighbors left chrysanthemums at her door. And when it was over, she did what she always did. She straightened her back and resumed walking. Only now her steps carried her to the cemetery, her silent refuge, day after day. Because here, at least, the stones expected nothing from her. Here she could still speak to him without shame. She would kneel, light her incense, whisper, "I hope you're at peace. I hope you're not angry." And the wind would carry no reply. Until today, when another voice answered her silence. A child's voice, calling her son Papa.
The first time Keiko truly saw them, really saw them, was when the boy looked up and met her gaze. That morning, she had walked the same path as always, her hands gloved despite the mild chill, a fresh bundle of white chrysanthemums tucked under her arm. The cemetery was quiet except for the faint scratching of a crayon. And there they were. The woman, clearly a foreigner, knelt in front of Daiki's grave, her shoulders hunched slightly against the breeze. Her hair was tied back loosely, a pale brown that caught the weak sunlight. Her clothes were modest, though clumsy in their way, a cardigan too light for the season, plain flats dusty from the stone path. And in her lap sat the boy, a child no more than 5, his tiny legs dangling over the edge of the stone base. He wore a soft green sweater, a knitted cap sliding off his hair just a shade darker than his father's, though unmistakably the same. Keiko froze mid-step, her throat tight. The woman held a sheet of paper in her hands, smoothing it before offering it to the boy. He giggled softly, took the crayon, and began scribbling. First a sun, then a little house, then two stick figures holding hands. When he finished, the woman whispered something in his ear, and the boy nodded with solemn determination. He slid off her lap, tiptoed to the headstone, and pressed the drawing flat against the cold granite. Then, in a clear voice, he said, "Papa, I miss you." The words rang out like a bell. Keiko felt her stomach clench. Her fingers tightened around the chrysanthemums until the stems creaked. The boy turned then, as though sensing her presence, and their eyes locked. For a second, the air seemed to still. Those eyes, they belonged to Daiki.
Keiko stepped back instinctively, ducking behind one of the taller gravestones, her breath coming faster than she would allow. From her hiding place, she watched. The woman, Emily, she would later learn, crouched to wipe a smudge of crayon from the boy's cheek. Her movements were gentle, unhurried. She smiled at him with a tenderness that made something sharp twist in Keiko's chest. It was obscene. This woman, this gaijin, kneeling at her son's grave, treating it as though it belonged to her. And the boy's laughter carried over the stones, soft and bright. He tugged at Emily's sleeve and pointed at something on the drawing, as if explaining his masterpiece. She nodded, her eyes damp but smiling. Keiko pressed her back to the cold marble behind her, willing herself to calm. It's impossible, she thought. Daiki would never, not with her, not like this. And yet, the boy's profile caught the light, and there it was again. Daiki's jawline, Daiki's smile, even the stubborn little crease above his brow. Keiko clutched the flowers to her chest, torn between retreating and confronting them then and there. Her pride screamed for her to leave, to erase this scene from her mind, to write it off as a misunderstanding. But her heart, traitorous and fragile, kept her rooted to the spot. She watched as the boy lay his small hand flat against the stone, murmuring something she couldn't hear. Emily reached out and placed her hand over his, and together they sat in silence, staring at the name carved into the granite. Daiki's name. Keiko's name. And now, another name, unspoken, written only in the boy's eyes, Yoshio. The next morning, Keiko told herself it had all been a mistake. She even tried to believe it. But by the third morning, she was already waiting for them before the sun rose. She stood in the shadows of a tall cedar near the back of the cemetery, clutching a folded fan in one hand, pretending she belonged to the silence. And just as she had suspected, they came again. Emily walked carefully up the path, her shoulders slightly hunched under a light coat, her arms wrapped protectively around Yoshio. The boy skipped ahead of her, crayon box clutched in one small fist, his little green cap slipping sideways. Keiko's lips tightened into a thin line. How dare she? Every movement of Emily's, her foreignness, her easy smiles, the way she knelt at the grave without hesitation, offended something deep inside Keiko. A woman like that did not belong here, did not belong to Daiki, did not belong to this family. Yet she couldn't stop watching. From her hiding place, she studied them. Emily carefully unwrapping a rice ball for Yoshio, brushing crumbs from his sweater, laughing quietly when he proudly showed her a crooked drawing of himself holding hands with his father. The boy pointed to the name on the gravestone and asked something, his little voice carrying faintly in the morning air. Keiko leaned forward, straining to hear, but the words were lost to the wind. Her chest ached in ways she couldn't name. Her pride screamed louder than her grief. It whispered all the things she had been taught to believe. A Japanese man, her son, would never truly love a foreign woman. He wouldn't risk the family name for someone like her. Surely not. And yet, the boy. It was the boy who broke her resolve each time. Whenever Yoshio smiled, whenever his eyes sparkled, she saw Daiki, the same stubborn curve to his lips, the same wayward hair that never stayed neatly combed, the same softness she had learned to scold out of her son. She hated herself for seeing it. The second week, she told herself she wouldn't go. She sat at her dressing table, fixing her hair into a perfect bun, ignoring the urge to check the clock. But the moment the hour struck, she found herself on the path again, moving with quiet urgency toward the cemetery. By now, she even knew their rhythm. Emily and Yoshio would arrive just after sunrise, leave just before the temple bell chimed 9. Each time she saw them, her thoughts grew more tangled. Part of her wanted to confront them immediately, to demand answers, to reclaim what was hers. But yet another part stayed frozen behind the cedar tree, unable to step out into the open. One morning she caught herself thinking, what harm would it do to just watch? That day, Yoshio wore a small blue scarf and carried a little toy train. He placed the train on the grave and bowed, whispering something into the stone before running back to Emily. She tousled his hair, kissed the top of his head. Keiko's fingers dug into her fan. Why did it bother her so much? Why did she care? The answer, though she dared not say it aloud, was obvious. Because every time she saw him, she couldn't help but see Daiki, alive again, just beyond her reach.
To understand why Emily kept coming to that grave, you had to understand why she came to Japan at all. Emily Parker had never fit neatly into her small town in Ohio. As a girl, she would spend hours watching old Studio Ghibli movies in her bedroom, fascinated by their quiet beauty, the cherry blossoms, the red gates, the misty mountains. While other girls planned weddings, Emily planned escape. When she turned 21, she applied for a program to teach English in Japan. Her mother hugged her goodbye at the airport, whispering, "You're brave, honey, but don't forget who you are." But that was exactly what she wanted, to forget who she was. Her first months in Osaka were harder than she'd expected. The language felt impossible, the trains dizzying. She worked at a public elementary school during the day and tutored adults in cafes at night, too proud to call home and admit how lonely she was. And then she met Daiki. She was waiting at a small coffee shop when he walked in, tall in a crisp suit, but with a softness around the edges that caught her off guard. He'd been sent there by a client to pick up documents, but paused when he saw her fumbling with the menu. In polite but shy English, he asked if she needed help. It was a small kindness, but to Emily, it was everything. They sat together that day and talked long after his errand was finished. After that, they began meeting secretly, always away from prying eyes. No photographs, no walks through crowded markets, just quiet dinners in tucked-away corners of the city, long conversations under the cover of night. She never pushed for more. She knew what he risked just being there.
For Daiki, Emily was a place to breathe, to laugh, to dream, to speak without fear of disappointing anyone. For her, he was proof that she wasn't invisible. It didn't last long, but it was real. When she found out she was pregnant, Daiki froze. He promised he would tell his mother. He promised he would find a way. But then, the accident. And just like that, everything she had clung to vanished. She decided to stay in Japan, not for herself, but for Yoshio. She wanted him to feel his father's presence, even if only through a name carved in stone.
She found a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood outside Kyoto and began raising him on her own. Every week, she would pack Yoshio's crayons and a snack, and they would take the train to the cemetery. She taught him to bow, to speak softly to the stone, to leave his drawings behind as little offerings. She never expected anyone to notice. She never expected her to notice. But here they were. And now, every time she knelt before the grave, she could feel Keiko's eyes, sharp and watchful, from somewhere behind the cedar tree.
It happened sooner than Emily expected, and much later than Keiko thought she could endure. That morning, the clouds hung low and heavy over Kyoto, the air damped with the promise of rain. Keiko arrived earlier than usual, her chest tight, her fingers clenched around the stems of her chrysanthemums. She had told herself again and again, "Today, today I will speak." And when she saw them, Emily crouched by the grave, Yoshio kneeling with crayons at his feet, her resolve finally broke. She didn't wait this time. Her sandals scraped sharply against the stones as she stepped out from behind the cedar tree. Emily froze mid-sentence, her eyes darting up in surprise. Yoshio glanced at her curiously but said nothing, still coloring quietly. Keiko stopped just a few paces away, her expression a mask of control, but her voice betrayed her. "Who are you?" Her words came out low and trembling. Emily swallowed hard, clutching Yoshio's shoulder instinctively, pulling him closer. Her lips parted as though she'd rehearsed this moment many times, but now that it was here, no words came. Keiko's gaze dropped to the boy. He was looking at her now, not shy, not afraid, just watching, his copper eyes glinting in the soft light. And there it was again, Daiki's eyes, his smile, his defiance. Why does he... Her voice faltered, then rose again, brittle and sharp. "Why does he call my son Papa?"
Emily took a shaky breath and stood slowly, positioning herself slightly in front of Yoshio. Her fingers tightened around his small hand. Her own voice was quiet but steady when she finally spoke. "Because he is." The words hit Keiko like a slap. Her shoulders stiffened, her grip on the chrysanthemums loosened until one stem fell to the ground. "You're lying," she said softly, but even she didn't believe it. "My son would never." Emily shook her head, her eyes glistening but calm. "He would," she whispered. "He did." The silence that followed was deafening. Keiko's knees threatened to buckle, but her pride kept her upright. She looked again at the boy, at the delicate slope of his nose, the way his hair curled slightly at the edges, the quiet confidence in his tiny hands as he placed another drawing on the stone. He wasn't just some child. He was Daiki's child. "Why didn't he tell me?" Keiko asked, almost to herself. Her voice cracked, her composure slipping like silk unraveling. Emily's lips tightened. "He wanted to," she said, "but he was afraid. He said you'd never accept us." Keiko flinched. Emily glanced at Yoshio, who was oblivious to the tension, humming softly to himself as he arranged his crayons. "We didn't want to cause trouble. We just come here so he can know his father. That's all." Keiko didn't answer, couldn't. She turned her eyes to Yoshio again. The boy looked up and met her gaze, and without a word, smiled. Something inside her, something she had locked away years ago, cracked. She dropped the rest of the chrysanthemums at the base of the stone, bowed stiffly, and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the path. But she didn't walk as fast as she could have, and she didn't look back.
The mansion had never felt so vast or so hollow.
That evening, Keiko returned home and walked through the darkened halls like a stranger in her own life. Her wooden sandals clacked against the polished floors, echoing in a way that reminded her how empty it really was. The chrysanthemums she had carried to the cemetery lay forgotten on the entryway table, already starting to wilt. She stood there for a long time, staring at them, before finally removing her coat and descending the grand staircase. In her bedroom she sat before her vanity and unpinned her hair with deliberate slowness, as if keeping her hands busy could quiet her mind. But it couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes she saw him, Yoshio, with Daiki's eyes, Daiki's mouth, Daiki's defiance, and Emily's soft, steady voice still reverberated in her chest, because he is. Keiko pressed her hands to her face, her breath catching. What had she done? How had she never seen what was happening right under her nose? She thought back to the nights when Daiki would come home late, quietly slipping into his room, avoiding her questions. The days when his gaze would drift toward the window during meetings, fingers sketching absent-mindedly on scraps of paper. She had scolded him then, said things she couldn't take back. "Stop wasting time. You have responsibilities. You are my son." And he had bowed, always bowed, but she remembered now the way his shoulders seemed heavier afterward, his laughter shorter, his eyes duller. Had she pushed him into silence? Had her rigid love left no room for him to breathe? Her gaze wandered to the family altar in the corner of her bedroom. She rose slowly and knelt before it, lighting a stick of incense. The smoke curled up, fragile and translucent, like the boy's smile. "Why didn't you tell me?" she murmured to the photograph of Daiki that stood there. "Did you think I wouldn't love him? Did you think I wouldn't love you?" Her voice cracked, and the tears she had swallowed all day finally slipped down her cheeks. The mansion was silent, except for the faint shuffling of the housekeeper downstairs. Keiko stayed kneeling, her back rigid at first, then slowly curving as she rested her head against the altar. She thought of Daiki as a boy, running through the garden with his little wooden blocks clutched in his hands, hair sticking to his sweaty forehead. She thought of how she used to scold him for getting dirt on his kimono, and how he'd only laugh, promising to clean it himself. And now that laugh was gone. But in Yoshio it lived on, and that realization was unbearable. Later that night, she found herself outside Daiki's room. The door still bore his name on a small wooden plaque. Her fingers hesitated on the handle before finally pushing it open. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. Stacks of notebooks, a pile of miniature trains, his favorite calligraphy brush resting neatly on the desk. And in the corner, on a dusty shelf, sat a little box of wooden blocks, the same ones he used to build castles with as a child. Keiko sank onto the tatami, picking up one of the blocks with trembling hands. She turned it over and over, pressing it to her chest as if it could anchor her. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to say aloud what she had never dared. "I'm sorry, Daiki." And in the stillness, she could almost hear his voice again, faint but unmistakable.
The next morning, Keiko told herself she wouldn't go, but her feet betrayed her before her pride could catch up. She arrived earlier than usual, the cemetery still cloaked in a faint morning mist. The stones gleamed damp and cold, and the air carried the faintest scent of incense and wet earth. She stood by the cedar tree, as she always did, and waited, and as always, they came. Emily, quiet and careful, with her cardigan buttoned to the top despite the gentle chill, and Yoshio skipping ahead, his little feet pattering against the stone path, a bundle of crayons peeking from his coat pocket. Keiko watched as they knelt before the grave, Emily brushing leaves from the base of the stone, while Yoshio fished through his pocket for his newest drawing. This time, it was more elaborate. 3 stick figures, holding hands, beneath a bright sun, their smiles wide and untroubled. At the top, written in shaky hiragana, Mama, Papa, Oba-chan, all together. The word hit her like a sudden gust of wind. Oba-chan, grandmother. Keiko's breath caught. She didn't even notice that her feet were already moving, carrying her closer, not too close, but close enough to see the waxy sheen of the crayons and the unsteady lines of the hearts he'd drawn. She stopped just a few steps away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Yoshio looked up, and then, without hesitation, he smiled. Not a shy, cautious smile, but a bright, trusting one. He held up the drawing and waved her over. "Look!" he called out, his little voice carrying easily in the morning air. "It's us! All of us!" Keiko's lips parted, but no sound came. For a moment, she simply stood there, stunned by the ease with which he included her, without question, without fear.
Emily glanced up, startled, her body stiffening as though expecting another reprimand. But Keiko didn't scold. She didn't turn away. Instead, she lowered herself slowly to one knee, careful, deliberate, and looked at the boy. He was so close now she could see the fine wisps of hair curling behind his ears, the faint smear of green crayon on his thumb, the little dimple in his cheek when he grinned. "You drew this?" she asked softly. Yoshio nodded enthusiastically. "For Papa, and you, because we're all together now." Keiko swallowed hard. She reached out, almost afraid, and let her fingertips brush the edge of the paper. It was warm from his hands. Her throat tightened as she looked at the clumsy stick figures, herself, Daiki, Emily, and Yoshio, all holding hands under the same sun. Her heart, once so guarded, cracked just a little wider. Yoshio tilted his head, studying her. "You can keep it," he said simply, pressing the drawing into her hands. Keiko stared down at it for a long moment before whispering, so quietly only the boy could hear, "Thank you, Yoshio." And for the first time in years, she smiled back.
The next time she saw them, she didn't stay hidden. It was a few days later, and the morning air carried the scent of plum blossoms just starting to bloom. Keiko stood at the gate, waiting, not behind the cedar, not pretending to arrange flowers, simply waiting. When Emily and Yoshio appeared at the far end of the path, they both paused. Emily's eyes widened when she saw Keiko standing there, and her grip on Yoshio's hand tightened instinctively. But Yoshio, as usual, didn't hesitate. He let go of his mother's hand and ran toward Keiko, with his little drawing flapping in the wind. Keiko crouched this time, waiting for him. He stopped in front of her, breathless, and held up another picture, a new one, of a house under a cherry tree. 4 stick figures now, not 3. "You added someone," Keiko observed quietly. "It's you," Yoshio announced proudly, "because now you're coming too." Something in Keiko's chest tightened again, but softer this time, almost pleasant. She stood, smoothing her kimono, and looked at Emily. Her voice faltered, but she steadied it. "I would like to invite you both to lunch. Tomorrow?" Emily blinked, stunned, her mouth parting slightly as though she hadn't heard correctly. "Lunch?" she repeated, her voice small. Keiko nodded, her hands clasped in front of her. "There is
A real tay, near the river, private, quiet. We can talk. Emily hesitated, glancing down at Yoshio, who was now busy tracing his finger over the carved characters on the gravestone. Keiko sensed her uncertainty and added quickly, "Just lunch, nothing more. You both deserve more than this place." Emily swallowed hard, her cheeks flushed. "All right," she said finally, bowing slightly. "Thank you." Yoshio piped up, oblivious to the tension. "Can I bring my crayons?" Keiko's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Of course," she replied. "You'll need them." The next day, the sky was clear and pale, and Keiko arrived at the Ryotei early. The tatami room was quietly elegant. A low table, shoji doors letting soft light in, a single white plum blossom in the corner. When Emily and Yoshio arrived, Emily paused at the threshold, her hands smoothing down her skirt as though to make herself smaller. But Yoshio marched right in, clutching his crayon box, and announced, "This is nice. Smells like tea." Keiko stood to greet them, bowing slightly, not too deep, but enough. Emily bowed lower. "Thank you for inviting us," she murmured. Keiko gestured toward the table. "Please, sit." They settled on the cushions, Yoshio between them, already spreading his paper and crayons. Keiko studied Emily from across the table. The nervous way she held her teacup, the way her gaze darted around the room as though she didn't quite believe she was meant to be there. But when Yoshio tugged at her sleeve and showed her his drawing, another scene of the four of them, this time under falling cherry blossoms, she smiled. And when he turned to Keiko and asked, "What's your favorite color so I can draw your kimono right?" Keiko felt a warmth bloom in her chest that she hadn't known was still possible. "Deep blue," she said softly, "like the river in spring." And for the first time, she meant it. If Keiko had ever believed the family garden no longer held any magic, Yoshio proved her wrong that day. It was late afternoon when she invited them, casually, as if it were nothing, to a place she hadn't shared with anyone in decades. "There's somewhere I'd like to take you both," she said simply. And they followed. The car wound through narrow streets until the mansion rose before them, still imposing, still immaculate. Emily hesitated at the gate, her eyes darting up to the tall wooden doors, her hand instinctively reaching for Yoshio's shoulder. But Yoshio pressed his face to the glass and gasped, "It's huge! Does it have dragons inside?" Keiko glanced at him, her mouth twitching upward. "Not anymore," she murmured. Inside, she led them past the silent halls, down a long corridor lined with shoji screens, and into the garden. The air was cooler here, fragrant with camellias and moss. Stone lanterns stood sentinel among sculpted pines. A koi pond glimmered in the center, its surface rippling with lazy orange and white shapes. This was his favorite place, Keiko said quietly, her eyes on the water. Emily stood a few steps behind her, but Yoshio broke away immediately, running down the narrow stone path toward the pond. He crouched to watch the fish, his laughter bright and unself-conscious. Keiko watched him, feeling the old ache return, but softer this time. He used to come here after school. When he thought no one was watching, he'd sit right there by the lantern and build castles out of stones. Emily glanced at her then, and something unspoken passed between them. After a long silence, Emily spoke. "He told me about this place once, said he wanted to bring me here, when it was time." Keiko stiffened slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Time," Emily nodded. "He said he couldn't live in hiding anymore, that he wanted you to know, about me, about Yoshio, about everything." Keiko inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the edge of her sleeve. "But he never did." Emily's voice softened.
He was going to. He promised. The night before, he said no more secrets tomorrow. Keiko closed her eyes, letting the words settle into her. They hurt, but not as much as she thought they would. And then, as if on cue, Yoshio turned and called out, "Oba-chan, look!" She opened her eyes to see him balancing carefully on one of the stones by the pond, holding his arms out like wings. "I'm a dragon now! See? Roar!" Keiko couldn't help it. A sound escaped her. Not quite a laugh, but something close. "Careful, little dragon," she said, her voice warm for the first time in years. Emily smiled faintly behind her, though Keiko didn't see. When Yoshio finally hopped down and ran back to them, he held out a small, smooth stone. "For you," he said simply, pressing it into Keiko's palm. "It's your castle now, too." Keiko looked down at the stone, at his tiny fingers still resting over hers. For the first time, she didn't feel like a trespasser in her own memories. For the first time, she felt home.
The rain came softly that day, thin and silvery, as if even the sky understood this moment required gentleness. Keiko stood under the awning of the garden pavilion, watching as Emily and Yoshio stepped inside. Emily's cardigan was damp at the shoulders, her cheeks flushed from the chill. Yoshio's small hands clutched a folded drawing, now smudged at the edges from his grip. He ran to the low table in the center of the room and carefully spread out his picture. Another scene of the four of them, this time beneath falling petals of cherry blossoms. "Oba-chan?" he said, looking up at her expectantly. "It's us again, but now there's more flowers." Keiko stared at the drawing, her heart tight in her chest. "Why more flowers?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. "Because now it's happier." Keiko lowered herself onto the cushion opposite him. Her hands hovered over the drawing, then settled gently on its corners. Her eyes moved over the stick figures, herself, Daiki, Emily, and Yoshio, and then she looked up at him. His copper eyes, so much like Daiki's, blinked back at her with quiet trust. "Yoshio," she began, and the boy tilted his head slightly. She hesitated. The words sat heavy in her throat. One breath, then another, and finally it came. "My grandson." The room fell quiet, except for the faint patter of rain against the wooden beams. Emily's breath caught softly behind her, but she didn't speak. Yoshio only smiled, that bright, uncomplicated smile, and crawled into her lap without waiting for permission.
Keiko stiffened at first, her hands hovering awkwardly above his small frame. But then, as he nestled closer, his warmth seeped into her, and she let her arms settle around him. She buried her face in his soft hair, inhaling the faint scent of crayons and rain. "You're my grandson," she murmured again, more to herself than to him. Emily wiped at her cheek quietly, pretending to adjust her sleeve. For a long time they sat like that. Keiko, Yoshio, and Emily. The quiet weight of the past replaced by something fragile, but alive. Eventually, Yoshio leaned back, his tiny hands patting her cheek with childlike affection. "Are you happy now, Oba-chan?" he asked, his voice serious. Keiko swallowed hard, her lips curving into something she hadn't felt in years. "Yes, I think I am." Outside, the rain slowed to a mist, and somewhere in the garden a single plum blossom shook free and drifted to the stones below. For the first time since Daiki's death, Keiko felt she could breathe, and in that quiet, with the boy's heartbeat pressed against hers, she realized family was never about perfection. It was about choosing, every day, to stay. The sky over Kyoto had cleared by the time they left the garden. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain and plum blossoms, and for the first time in years, Keiko didn't walk alone.
She watched as Yoshio skipped ahead, his little hand tugging at Emily's as they moved down the stone path. At one point, he turned and waved back at her, calling out with that bright smile, "Come on, Oba-chan, we're waiting!" And she followed, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Behind her, the mansion stood silent. The family name still hung heavy over its doors, the traditions still intact. But in her hands, she carried something far more fragile and far more precious. A folded crayon drawing of 3 hearts connected by a single red line. And in that quiet moment, Keiko finally understood. Family wasn't about keeping the cracks hidden. It was about letting the light in through them, even when it came from unexpected places, even when it looked nothing like the plan you once imagined. So she walked a little faster, closing the distance between them. Because in the end, family wasn't just blood, it was a choice. And this time, she chose to stay. What would you do if you discovered that the person you lost had left you one last chance to love? Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Keiko's place? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of family between 2 worlds. Leave a like if this story touched you, and tell us where you're watching from.